I said earlier that there was a hormonal effect of food, and so some foods have different effects or impacts on your hormones. As we mentioned earlier, we said that carbohydrates, excessive carbs, will impact your insulin level. We said that gluten could cause thyroid hormone disruption. We know that. There have been hundreds of studies now that confirm that gluten sensitivity can create low thyroid. We know that foods that create inflammation, like sugar, okay, and again, if you're gluten sensitive, that's an inflammatory process, will increase your cortisol. Cortisol will cause you to gain weight. We know that gluten can also, interestingly enough, gluten can cause low testosterone in men. It can cause progesterone hormone disruption in both women and men. And we know that estrogen as well can be affected by gluten. But we also know there are foods like soy, phytoestrogens, and this has actually been studied too, that too much aggressive soy can make it hard to lose weight as well. I just thought I'd point that out. I'm not saying that all soy is 100% bad, but if you're a vegan and you eat soy everything, and you're eating the soy dogs and the soy hamburgers and the soy, patties, all the concoctions that they compress with soy, you're going to run into a problem with hyperestrogenism. Too much estrogen makes it hard to lose weight. So this brings me to another point, which is, ladies, those of you taking BCP, birth control pills, or estrogen compounds, maybe you were prescribed like a bioidentical estrogen or an estrogen therapy. Look, I'm not saying that that's wrong. I'm not saying that you shouldn't do that if your doctor prescribed it. But I am saying if you started that estrogen and you started to gain weight, then you need to start asking questions. I see a lot of doctors that prescribe hormone therapies and they don't ever test their patients' hormone levels. They just put them on estrogen and then they never check their estrogen levels again. I've had people come into my office, we'll get their estrogens far higher than what they should be when we test it in the bloodstream, far higher, because they're being over-medicated with it. So if you're on those, just make sure you ask your doctor to check. Now, on that same note, there are some other medications. Let's make a little bit of room here. There are some other medications that you want to be aware of that can also cause hormonal changes that can lead to weight loss resistance because of those hormonal changes. And one of them is the class of medications called SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. So these are medicines used oftentimes to treat depression, right? And sometimes they're used to treat chronic pain. But if you're on an SSRI like Paxil or Prozac, you want to be aware if you started gaining weight after you started that medication, just be aware that could be the problem, or that could be part of the problem. If you're taking corticosteroids, drugs like prednisone, asthma inhalers, these are steroids. And we know directly that these medications can cause muscle loss and fat gain simultaneously. They cause muscle and bone loss and fat gain simultaneously. So if you're on these classes of medicines and you've really been struggling with your weight, get with your prescribing doctor and revisit why you're on these medications, because generally speaking, SSRIs are used to treat depression, corticosteroids are used to treat inflammation, okay, and inhalers typically asthma. Now, I'm not going to blame gluten on everything in the world, every disease in the world, but we know that gluten can cause inflammation, gluten can cause depression, and gluten can cause asthma. And again, if you go back and read No Grain, No Pain, you'll find the research that correlates these truths. And so you might find that your diet, if you haven't changed your diet, if you change your diet, then these problems diminish and potentially even can go away. Then you may not need the medicine as you move into the future. So important to understand that concept. So how grains cause weight gain. Now, I just showed you that grains from a carbohydrate perspective caused weight gain because grains are high carbohydrate, and so all that excessive carbohydrate can lead to insulin resistance, nutritional deficit, and other issues. But I want to show you another way, because it's not, I said grains. I didn't say gluten, okay? We didn't write in here not how gluten. It's not just gluten. It can be gluten, but it's not just gluten. What else does grain contain? Grains contain heavy metals, excessive omega-6. They contain substances known to cause leaky gut, like ATIs. So if we say here, ATIs, which are a leaky gut inducing proteins. We know that grains contain excessive carbs, which I just talked about. We know that they can contain mold and mycotoxins. We know GMO, the pesticides, the chemicals sprayed on the grain. We know grains contain glutens as well, and pesticides, mycotoxins. So when you're eating a lot of grain, this is kind of part and parcel. These are many of the things that you're also getting exposure to. So all these things combined are going to lead to that inflammation. That inflammation leads to a chronic cortisol response. Now, what did I just say about corticosteroids? I said one of the drugs that causes weight gain is steroids. Now, remember, you make your own steroids. You make your own corticosteroids. And if you have hyperinflammation, if you have chronic inflammation, a disease of chronic inflammation, who is that? That's people that have autoimmune disease. That's people that have chronic pain, arthritis, if you will, the rheumatological arthritides, especially like rheumatoid arthritis and lupus, etc. So if you've got chronic inflammation, right, your body's naturally going to respond to that chronic inflammation by hyperproducing cortisol. It's going to make more cortisol over time. Just like the drug cortisol can cause muscle loss and weight gain, so can when your body makes too much. This is why we see people with hypercortisolemia. We see these individuals start to do what? We see them start to gain weight and lose muscle. When you gain weight and lose muscle, that leads to joint compression and joint pain, because as your muscles shrink around your joints, the joints are further compressed, okay? And when you lose that weight when you gain that weight and you lose that muscle and the joint's more compressed, what that generally leads to is pain, right? So then what do we do when we're in pain? We avoid the exercise, okay? And when we avoid exercise, we generally crave those comfort foods. Grain is one of those comfort foods. One of the things I didn't mention here is grain contains morphine compounds that make you feel happy, that get your fix on, right? So if you've ever wondered why you crave certain baked goods or cookies or other things, it may just very be you're getting your morphine fix. There's a protein in grain called gluteomorphin that basically gives you a fix, a drug-like fix. And so when you're in chronic pain, as you're avoiding exercise, as you want to feel better, you gravitate toward choosing that food because it gives you that temporary relief, but it creates this vicious cycle, again, of chronic inflammation, chronic joint deterioration, chronic hormonal changes and abnormalities. Now, all that being said, before I move on to this next slide, all that being said, okay, what do we have to do? Because some of you say, one of the reasons I hear is I don't exercise because I hurt. So due to increases in pain, I don't exercise. So step one, if you can't exercise because you're in chronic pain, step one is change your diet. Okay, change your diet where you avoid the grains, the dairy, the sugars, the obesogens, okay, all the chemicals, the processed junk that people call food. People call strange things food. And so you avoid the wrong foods, but then you actually look at what you are eating in terms of real food and look at those ratios overall. Do you have equality within your ratios? Then we come back here and we say, okay, well, if all those things are true, are we over-consuming total calories based on our basic metabolic rate and our exercise? So again, remember, we're saying that if you can't exercise, then you go off of your basic metabolic rate as to the quantity of calories you consume in a day. And if you're over-consuming calories that's higher than your BMR, even if you're eating all the right foods, even if you're eating everything perfectly well, you're going to run into problems. Now, one other point, I talked about this way back here, and I didn't mention much about it, but sleep. Sleep, why is sleep important? Okay, came back to this because sleep regulates cortisol and melatonin. Now, melatonin is one of the most powerful anti-inflammatories that our body produces. It's powerful anti-inflammatory. If you're not sleeping, you have an imbalance between your cortisol levels will go up, your melatonin will drop. So you'll lose the anti-inflammatory action of melatonin, and then you'll have the effect of elevations of cortisol, which will cause your muscle loss and cause your weight to gain. So that sleep becomes very, very important as maintaining your circadian rhythm, but also maintaining the balance of those hormones. So you got to keep that sleep piece in mind. Hey, don't forget to check out the rest of the series right here. Make sure you hit subscribe below. And as always, thanks for tuning in.